Hello and welcome back. We're talking about chapter two of the Rachel's book, and this is where he addresses cultural relativism as an ethical theory. So he starts off with a little anecdote from history. So Herodotus was a famous Greek historian uh, who, you know, history back then was a slightly different enterprise than it is now. So sometimes Herodotus didn't let the truth get in the way of a good story often. But at any rate, this is what Herodotus recounts. He talks about Darius, the king of Persia, who was sort of they were the biggest empire at the time, and they were at war with the Greeks from time to time. And Darius, the king, he notices that different cultures have different burial practices. So, one group of people, known as the Calations, they ate the dead bodies of their ancestors. So, if a grandfather died, you would, in a sort of ceremonial way, um, eat eat his body, right? And this was for them the only sort of respectful thing to do with your dead relative, right? Greeks, on the other hand, burned their dead on funeral pyres. This sort of thing still sometimes goes on in sort of India and the East over there. Um, and for them, that was the only respectful thing to do, right? Is to burn your dead. So Darius was sort of struck by this difference. He invited a group of Greeks to his palace, and you know, probably having a bit of fun with them, he asked them, "Hey, how much money would I have to pay you for you to eat your dead relatives?" Greeks were shocked, insulted. They said no amount of money, right, could ever excuse, right, doing that to your relatives. And then he brings over some collations and asks them, "Hey, how much would I have to pay you to burn your dead relatives?" And they were shocked, right? Disgusting, no amount of money. Um, so it seemed like each culture, right, thought their most sacred practices, um, when viewed from the outside, looked like moral outrage, right? Um, so significant differences between the two. Now, this is not just ancient history. We can look to the more recent past to uh, to see a similar situation. So, um, native peoples of the American North, sometimes called Eskimos. That's not like the most precise term, but Inuit is also not the most precise term. So I'm just calling them native peoples of the American North, but I might switch around between terms for simplicity. But anyway, at any rate, these folks had developed many practices before they sort of encountered uh, European Europeans that were very different from ours. So, practice polygamy. Uh, if you had a guest in your home, you might offer them to have sex with your partner as a sort of form of hospitality, right? Oh, here, let me make you a meal, and would you like to have sex with my wife? That sort of thing. High-ranking males in the tribe would be allowed to have sex with the partners of the lower-ranking males if they wanted to. But it was a little more complicated than just treating women like property because any female partner who objected to this could leave their partner, right? So they weren't required to stick with a husband if they didn't like, you know, whatever the husband was offering the, their friends sex with their wife and so on. So she could go find some other arrangement that was more to her liking. So, sort of very different practice than we're sort of used to in our culture. Uh, Also, more strikingly, infanticide was common, particularly of female babies. They would be sort of left out in the cold to die. And similarly with elderly relatives, beyond a certain point, they would also sometimes be abandoned in the cold to die. So I assume that many of you, your sort of, you know, intuition was like, that feels wrong to me, right? Not leave a baby out or an elderly relative into the cold to die. Right? You may have even sort of their sexual practice may have struck you as wrong. So similar thing, right? From the viewpoint of another culture, things they do that might seem perfectly normally morally good, even morally required, from another perspective might seem very wrong. So all this is just to say, yeah, cultures differ in their moral practices, right? An undeniable fact, or on on the surface. Well, later we'll see if we can question that. And some of these differences seem from the outside as horrible, grave moral failings, and vice versa, right? So the culture that eats their dead may find cremation deeply immoral. So for now, let's accept that this is a fact. It does seem to be the case. Um, what does that mean? What should we conclude from it? Is one culture wrong, right, and one culture right? So is it that eating the dead actually is wrong and the Galatians were just wrong, right? Or is there something else going on? Is there just really no fact of the matter? Meaning that maybe for the Galatians, eating your dead is the right thing to do, right? And maybe for the Greeks, burning your dead is the right thing to do. Is morality relative to culture? So the claim that there is no culture independent standard of morality, right? That morality can be different from culture to culture and they can both be right. We'll call this view cultural relativism. Here's a quote from W.G. Sumner. The quote, right way is the way which the ancestors used and which has been handed down. The notion of right is in the folk ways. It is not outside of them, of independent origin, and brought to test them. In the folk ways, whatever is right. This is because they are traditional, therefore contain in themselves the authority of ancestral good. When we come to the folkways, we are at the end of our analysis. So what Sumner is saying here is that there's nothing more to morality than culture, and whatever a culture does, that's the right thing to do, right? When you hit the sort of folk practices, you've hit rock bottom when it comes to morality. So this is interesting. So it seems like some people believe it. Sumner believes it, right? And if we believe cultural relativism, that's a significant claim, right? That would have severe implications for ethics and for our theory of ethics that we're searching for here. It would seem to imply that there is no universality and there is no objectivity with ethics, right? Ethics is sort of arbitrary or sort of secondary to the culture, and the cultural codes are in some way arbitrary, right? As Sumner says, uh, whatever they do, that's the right thing to do, right? And if they had done something different, then that would have been the right thing to do. It seems sort of arbitrary. So if true, a pretty extreme claim. So, cultural relativists have made a variety of claims, some more extreme than others. Uh, Here are five that Rachel's lists that have been kicked around. Um, and they range from like number one, different societies have different moral codes. Yeah, that seems to be sort of true if you look at the examples, Greeks and Galatians and Eskimos and so on. Number two, the moral code of a society determines what is right in that society. So if a society says that a certain action is right, then that action is right, at least in that society. That seems to be what Sumner was saying in the quote earlier. It's a stronger claim than claim number one, but it's what some people conclude, right? When they look at all the differences, they say, yeah, well, I can't say which one's right, which one's wrong. Maybe they're both right. So number two seems to entail number three here. There is no objective standard that can be used to judge one society's moral code as better than another's. There are no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. That would follow, right? If both the Greeks and the Galatians are right at the same time, then there's no truth outside the culture, right? There's no objective truth by which we can judge them. Number four, the moral code of our own society has no special status. It's but one among many. That also seems to follow. And then number five, it is arrogant of us to judge other cultures. We should always be tolerant of that, of them. That would also seem to follow if, whatever that culture does is right for them. So these are claims that, cultural relativists have made. Are they true? Right? We always ask whether they're true. So far, number one seems on the surface obviously true. Cultures do differ in their moral um, codes, right? Number five, we jump ahead to number five, seems independently of, the other claims. Number five seems like an admirable uh, goal, right? To try to tolerate other cultures and respect other people, even if they're different from us. Um, but some of these claims are a bit more controversial. For example, claim two, right, which says, well, the culture itself determines what is right and wrong. That seems like I can imagine some counterexamples to that. For example, Think about Nazis, right? If we can see that Nazis were a culture, which maybe you would argue they aren't, right? But you probably find other examples with things other cultures have done that are nearly as deplorable. Um, right? You say, oh, well, when you're within the world of Nazis, right, whatever they do is fine, that you would seem to have to say that they were right to commit genocide. Um, I don't know of anybody who's willing to go that far, right? I'm certainly not willing to go that far and say that the Nazis were right to commit genocide, right? So if cultural relativism entails that the Nazis were right, there's something wrong with cultural relativism, right? So it seems like if we want to tolerate all cultures, well, some cultures are going to be intolerant, and tolerating the intolerant leads to problems and contradictions, right? So, maybe maybe a cultural relativist could find ways to sort of weasel out of the Nazi pickle and say, well, you know, when Nazis invade Poland, now they're subject to Polish culture, and so what they were doing in Poland was wrong, by the rules of the Polish. But you still got the problem of, the Jews living in Germany that were, murdered. So, uh, what counts as a culture, right? Which were the Jews in their own culture within the Nazi culture? I'm not saying the cultural relativists couldn't find some way out of the Nazi example, but it gets tricky. You have to get into the details of how you define a culture and the boundaries of a culture. So let's sort of formalize this cultural relativist uh, intuition into a formal argument. So here we have two versions of the same argument. One is sort of more specific and the other more general. Very simple argument. One premise and a conclusion. So here's the first version. Premise. Number one, the Galatians believe it is right to eat their dead, while the Greeks believe it is wrong. Therefore, conclusion, eating the dead is neither objectively right or wrong. It is merely a matter of opinion, which varies from culture to culture. So that conclusion is specific to eating the dead, right? Um, but we can, or here's another sort of more specific one. Sorry, this more general one is coming later. The native people of the American North believe that infanticide is not wrong, whereas Europeans believe it's wrong. Conclusion, therefore, infanticide is neither objectively morally right or wrong. It is merely a matter of opinion that varies from culture to culture. We see the same structure to this argument. We note a difference between cultures, and we conclude, okay, there's no objective right or wrong on that matter. Both. Now, here's the general form of the argument. Premise: different cultures have different moral codes. Conclusion: therefore, there is no objective truth in morality. Morality is a matter of opinion, and it differs from culture to culture. So that's the argument. It's a simple one. We can ask ourselves whether it's a good one, right? Um, so there's a couple ways to analyze whether an argument is good. First, you want the premise to be true, right? But secondly, you want there to be a strong connection between the premise and the conclusion, right? You want the premise, if true, to sort of force you to accept the conclusion as true. And we can question this argument on both points here. So for now, let's assume that premise one is true, right? Um, let's say the different cultures do have different moral codes. We seem to have seen some examples of that. We can still ask, well, just because number one is true, does that mean that we have to believe the conclusion, right? Does the conclusion follow from one? Is it entailed by the premise? And it's actually not at all obvious that the conclusion follows. So the premise is something about what people believe, and the conclusion is about something about objective truth, right? And these are really distinct issues, right? Lots of people believe lots of things, and lots of people believe a lot of things that are false, right? So just because people differ in their beliefs doesn't mean that there's no truth about anything, right? So, for example, we've got the Greeks and the Galatians. So we've got a disagreement, right? The Galatians say it's right to eat your dead and wrong to burn them. The Greeks say it's right to burn your dead, wrong to eat them. Um, and based on that disagreement, the cultural relativist concludes, well, yeah, there's no truth in the matter, right? But think about this, like, what if there was a culture that believes the Earth is flat, and another culture, right, ours, that believes that the Earth is round? Um, does that mean that both there's no fact of the matter, and the Earth is flat for them and the Earth is round for us? Well, no, right? Geography is right. Astronomy is not a matter of opinion. Um, the Earth does have a determinate shape, right? And if there's a culture that believes that the Earth is flat, that culture is wrong, right? So what we've just shown is differences of opinion don't necessarily entail that there's no fact of the matter and everyone's right about whatever they believe, right? Differences of opinion sometimes mean that, someone's wrong, right? Someone's right and someone's wrong. That's one way that differences happen. So just because people have differences of opinion on moral issues doesn't mean that there's no objective morality. It might very well mean that some people are wrong about morality. So that's one problem with the argument for cultural relativism. But again, just because that argument fails doesn't necessarily mean that cultural relativism is false. Argument for it yet. So here's an attempt to refute cultural relativism itself, right? By saying, look, let's assume it's true and let's see what would follow if it was true. And if something obviously false follows from cultural relativism, that means that cultural relativism must be false. A sort of argument uh, ad absurdum. It's used in mathematics a lot. If you've ever, or maybe if you've done proofs in geometry, you want to prove something false, right? You assume it to be true and then show that some sort of contradiction or absurdity follows from it. So let's, for the moment, assume cultural relativism is true, right? And see what that entails. Well, it seems like it would entail that we can't ever say that cultural practices of some other culture are inferior to our own or wrong. Now, initially, that seems like a good thing, right? We want to be respectful of other cultures. We want to be tolerant. But it also means that we have to be tolerant of things like fascism, genocide, and other very bad things that happen throughout history in various cultures, right? So it seems like if we accept cultural relativism, we could never say, for example, that genocide is bad if a culture practices it. And that, for many people, and for me, seems like going a bit too far. Right? We should be able to condemn genocide. Furthermore, not only would we not be able to criticize other cultures, we wouldn't even be able to criticize our own culture, right? Remember that cultural relativism claims that, well, right and wrong are in the folkways, right? Whatever the culture does, that's right. It's just kind of arbitrary in that way. Well, that means that whatever our culture does is always just perfectly morally good, right? Um, and so it's not just about humility assessing other cultures, right? It's also a sort of arrogance about our own culture. Um, And if you think that there are any ways in which, for example, current American culture could be improved, I have these pictures of pigs. If any of you are vegetarians or vegans, you might think that, what we do to animals is deeply immoral, right? Or you may have some other ideas about some other practices you think are immoral. Um, if cultural relativism is true, then you can't say that's wrong, right? You can't say anything we do is wrong. What we do is sort of by definition morally right. And it follows from this that if cultural relativism is true, then there's no moral progress, right? Because if whatever we do at any time as a culture is right, then if our cultural practices change, that can never be an improvement, right? It's just going from what we do now was right, what we did in the past was right, even if it's different, and what we do in the future, if we change it again, that'll be right too, right? And that seems, if you look at the history for just of our culture, the United States, it seems like, yeah, there has been moral progress, right? Slavery used to be legal in this country. Then we got rid of it, right? Then segregation was legal, and then we got rid of that, right? We have been, just on the issue of race, right, gradually improving morally in the way we deal with people of different races, right? So we've got these three things that seem to follow from cultural relativism, and if any one of those three is a little too much for you to swallow, right? Never criticize another culture, that you can never criticize your own culture, that there can never be moral progress within a culture. Um, if you can't swallow any one of those, then maybe cultural relativism is false, right? Because those seems to follow pretty straightforwardly from cultural relativism. So Rachel's is not done beating up on cultural relativism just yet, right? So we've seen, the argument for cultural relativism. Uh, we saw that the premise, if it's true, doesn't necessarily entail the conclusion. Now we're going to question whether that premise is actually even true, right? So remember, the premise was different cultures differ in their moral practices. And that seemed so obviously true, right? One culture that eats their dead, the other burns their dead, one practices infanticide, one doesn't. Um, but if we look at these practices a little more closely, Rachel's argues maybe those aren't actually moral differences. Maybe they're differences of a different sort. He says, for example, look at some Hindu cultures where it's forbidden to eat, right? Even though sometimes food is scarce, right? And cows would be a good source of protein, and yet nonetheless they do not eat the cows. Whereas for in our culture, some of us are vegetarians, but for the most part, it's seen as morally fine to eat a cow, right? Particularly if you're very hungry. Um, so that seems like a would seem like an obvious moral difference between American culture and Hindu culture, right? But if you look more deeply at the reason behind these differences, um, you'll see that in fact it's a difference in our beliefs about sort of metaphysics in the universe, right? So the reason that eating cows is forbidden is because um, they believe in reincarnation, right? And so any animal has very likely the reincarnated soul of many other possibly animals and then possibly other humans too, right? So it's entirely possible that any given cow is actually the reincarnation of, say, your grandmother, right? Well, if you believed that, right? If you thought, well, this cow might, right, embody the soul of my grandmother, you might not be inclined to eat it either, right? So what looks on the surface like a moral difference is actually a difference in your beliefs about how the universe works. Anybody who had those beliefs, so anybody who believed in reincarnation, very well might not want to eat cows, right? Um, so if you scratch the surface, right, these apparent moral differences might actually be different types of differences. Here, we actually have a difference in our belief about metaphysics, not so much about morality, right? And let's look at this issue of infanticide, right? So, what was the reason for the infanticide? Was it just that they don't think human life is valuable, right? Or that babies are or have any sort of moral worth? Well, not necessarily, right? You have to look at their circumstances, um, and the environment, right, that these people were living in just didn't provide enough resources to have as many children as they might have liked, right? And they also lacked some access to birth control at the time. So what ends up happening is people are giving birth to more children than they can feed, right? Um, rather than have the whole family starve, sometimes they would sacrifice one for the good of the whole, right? Um, it was disproportionately female babies because men were the ones dominantly, primarily hunting for food, and were frequently killed in the hunt, and so there was a shortage of men, right, of male babies. So if you think about their lives, you can put yourself in that situation. You could easily imagine that they in fact valued human life just as much as we did, right? Um, they were just in a much tougher situation than we were, and in order to survive, they had to make some really hard choices, right? And maybe if we were in that situation, we would make those same choices, right? So if that's the case, then it's not actually a moral difference, right? It's just a difference in the circumstances we find ourselves, right? Given the same circumstances, maybe we would all make the same choices. So both of these examples, which appear to be moral differences, actually are consistent with moral agreement. It's just different beliefs and metaphysics, right? Not so much about morality or different circumstances you find yourself in. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? You couldn't really have a culture that truly didn't care about the lives of infants, right? Such a culture would not reproduce and survive very long, right? Um, Likewise, there you can think of a number of, you know, universal moral um, values, right? a culture didn't value honesty, uh, then you could never believe anything anyone ever said, and you could see how it would be hard to get a society together where you could like do business with people and trade and develop any sort of like large society, right? Imagine a society that decided murder was right? That seems like that's very quickly, right? So it seems like there are in fact some necessary ethical values that in order to have a culture at all, you would have to believe in, right? Everyone would have to believe in, hey, let's not kill each other, the truth whenever possible, and let's take care of our children. Right? Those seem like pretty basic things you need to even get a culture started. So perhaps those are going to be universal, and maybe there are some universal, which is probably bad news for cultural relativism. So another example, which was in the news, I don't know, a couple, this practice, which is sometimes called excision, sometimes called female circumcision, sometimes called female genital mutilation, is the practice of surgically removing a woman's clitoris. It's practiced in some Middle Eastern and Asian cultures. Um, so this practice has been performed on over 200 million women worldwide in over 30 countries. Uh, some cases, in that culture, women look forward to it, right? It's a rite of passage into womanhood. It's, kind of a big deal. But there have also been cases where, understandably from our perspective, they desperately try to avoid it, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this woman's name, uh, but Fazia Kasimja, she was one of the latter, right? She did not want this procedure done, and so she escaped her home country and fled to America, and she was eventually granted asylum. Um, and this sort of hit the news and it kind of occasioned a debate about whether is this a immoral, barbaric practice, or is this, another culture thing that we should respect their practices, right? It brought cultural relativism, or pros and cons of it into the national conversation. Now, there's a lot of bad things about excision. It's painful, it results in the loss of sexual pleasure, and you can have bad side effects like chronic pain. Even people can die. It doesn't have any known medical benefit. Not even actually like a religious practice. It seems to be a cultural practice. Um, Now, it doesn't seem to be like a necessary for survival. Like you could explain infanticide. Um, so that there doesn't seem to or be a lot going for it, right? It doesn't seem very or even a very safe or healthy thing. I mean, the people that practice it, the reason they do it, the reason they claim is that remove a woman's capacity for sexual pleasure, then that will reduce fidelity, it will make women less focused on sex and more focused on work and things like that. So, they give us reasons. People do provide arguments for their moral claims. Um, but from our perspective, those reasons seem relatively weak, right, compared to the of it. So, cultural relativists would say, hey, right, it's not our place to judge, to each your own, but, some of you may have, and many people in our culture had strong, right, moral intuitions that this practice is plain wrong. So, there um, are reasons for us to be sort of practice humility when it comes to our sort of instincts about what's right or wrong, right? If we look at the history of the U.S., often we have been involved in what people call cultural imperialism, right? Um, Coming to the Americas and seeing the Native Americans and judging them to be sort of like immoral and in need of Christianity. And we set up this mission system, in California, and it was supposed to be saving their souls and it's supposed to be a moral, crusade. And in fact, we just, um, but, you can judge something to be immoral without sending in a military or a bunch of, missionaries to go and change it, right? we're at this point just talking at a very abstract level of like, well, what is right and wrong, and what would be right and wrong. Um, you know, we're not saying then you have to take the next step of sending in the military to stop the culture from doing the thing, right? So you can generally be tolerant, right, and not abuse people or harm people and still judge that what they're doing is wrong, and maybe seek to change them by conversation or something like that instead. All right, so back to our five original claims. Let's sort of reevaluate now that we've talked through all these. So, the cultural relativist says, hey, different societies have different moral codes. This was their premise and their argument for cultural relativism. Yeah, that's partially true. That's certainly true sometimes, right? Um, but also, it seems like there's necessarily going to be similarities. Again, every society is going to have to value honesty, value life, murder. And then we also have to say, hey, not every difference is necessarily a moral difference, right? It might be a difference in your metaphysical beliefs or in the sort of environment you find yourself in. Right? Number two, the moral code of society determines what is right within that society. Well, we saw that that claim doesn't follow from claim one, right? So we can see two cultures disagree, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're both right. One of them might be wrong, right? And, you know, most of us, I think, our gut intuition is, yeah, some cultures are definitely wrong. The Nazis were wrong, right? And we'd be able to say that. So the third claim was there are no objective moral standards that can be used to judge one society's moral code as better than another's. So is that true? I mean, yeah, it's hard to come up with, a universal moral principle that applies at all times. That's kind of what we're doing with this course, at least in part, right? So it's not an easy thing. Um, but we shouldn't assume at the outset that it's impossible. A good start would be like, don't harm other people for no good reason. That seems like a pretty good principle that's like everyone might want to accept, right? And that every culture should accept. So, um, number three is not obviously true, right? They definitely need to tell us that there's no objective morality. Number four, the moral code of our own society has no special status, for sure, right? Look at our history. Obviously, our own culture has made grave moral mistakes, from slavery to, our Native Americans and so on. Um, but that's consistent with, some cultures being better or worse than other cultures. So just because your culture makes mistakes and you recognize that, it doesn't mean that relativism. You can say, no, we were actually wrong about that, and is right and wrong, right? And number five, it's arrogant of us to judge other cultures. We should always be tolerant of them. So yeah, it is arrogant to just sort of jump, right, without thinking it through. But you can make a judgment, and that's not necessarily arrogant, right? Not arrogant to say the Nazis were bad, right? You could think very carefully about whether genocide is a bad thing, and any reasonable person will come to the conclusion that it's a bad thing, right? So, judge, this class is all going to be about formulating moral judgments, and you should feel free to do so as long as you do it in a careful and reasonable way. Nothing wrong or particularly arrogant. All right. Summing up, we have seen, that the arguments for cultural relativism um, are not very convincing, right? We've also seen that cultural relativism has some consequences that seem pretty wrong or absurd. Um, and we've seen that there actually is a fair amount of ethical sort of uniformity among cultures, and it would. So we're going to start, if you like cultural relativism and you think it's true, by all means write a paper about it, right? Go into the discussion and argue with Rachel. But Rachel comes to a clear conclusion here. He thinks there is something objective about morality, and he thinks cultural relativism is wrong. So that's we're gonna the next lecture we're gonna sort of be beating up on another form of relativism that says, well, morality is just subjective to each individual person, right? And we'll see that in the end, Rachel's thinks that's wrong as well. Right? So there's definitely a bit of a slant to this book in favor of objectivity and morality, and I think there's good reasons for it. But you don't have to believe it, right? You can certainly argue with any of these claims, right? But I'm just going to be upfront, right? This is what Rachel thinks. He thinks morality is not relative. And, you know, I encourage you to think about, maybe in discussion, right? Uh, some of Look to our past. It's easy to see some of our old practice that we're clearly now we can see we're very much wrong. But the hard part is to criticize our culture now, right? Because all of these assumptions we make, we're sort of blind to them, right? If we took this class 100 years ago, all the students would say, "Oh, interracial marriage, it's obviously wrong." Like, but now 100 years later, we say, "Well, no, that would be bigoted," right? So, are we in any way sort of bigoted right now in ways that we can't even sort of recognize? It's an interesting practice. It's sometimes called ideological critique. Uh, so there's one good thing about cultural relativism, which is it's an antidote to dogmatism, right? Just assuming that whatever your way is the right way without offering good reasons, right? So the one good thing we can take away from cultural relativism is a little humility about our own culture, right? But it doesn't have to entail total relativism, right? We can take that, hey, we should think about what we're doing and rationally make sure that there are good reasons for our moral practices. All right. Well, I will see you on Wednesday with the next lecture on subjectivism.